Hello and welcome to Spinster's Library. I'm Claudia and today I want to talk about Seeking Mansfield by Kate Watson, published in 2017. As you can probably guess from the title, this is a young adult retelling of Jane Austen's novel Mansfield Park. Full disclosure, Mansfield Park is my least favourite Jane Austen novel. I've read it 2 or 3 times and I just can't get into it. But despite my personal dislike of the original novel, I've always been of the opinion that this would make a fantastic modern young adult retelling. It has all the ingredients for it. A teenage protagonist, a world set against her, and a Cinderella plotline complete with the evil stepsisters. Which is why it's all the more disappointing that this enormous potential for a fantastic modernized version simply isn't utilized by this retelling. But let's start at the beginning. Seeking Mansfield is the story of Finley Price, a teenage theatre and film nerd who grows up in Chicago with the family of her godparents, the Bertrams. She's particularly close with their son Ollie, who protects her from his mean sister Juliet and their even meaner aunt Nora. What Finley really wants is to be accepted into the prestigious summer youth program at the nearby Mansfield Theatre. She tries to juggle her job as a janitor with what she considers her duties in the Bertram household, which include looking after the chronically ill Mrs. Bertram and helping out the oldest son, bad boy Tate, whenever he gets himself in a bit of a pickle. But one day, teenage movie stars Harlan and Emma Crawford move in next door and chaos ensues. Or not, because honestly what this book could have done with a lot more is chaos. I wouldn't go so far as to call it boring, but the plot is predictable even if you haven't read Mansfield Park, and the prose is just not sharp enough to make it interesting. It's a bit dull and the author relies heavily on clichés in her writing, which by itself isn't a bad thing, and mediocre prose isn't usually enough to put me off a book. But it is unfortunate when you inevitably set yourself up for a comparison with the brilliantly sparkling prose of Jane Austen. One thing that no one, not even I, noted Mansfield Park hater, can accuse Jane Austen of is a lack of nuance. In fact, Mansfield Park might be the most nuanced of her novels when it comes to character depth. Other than Aunt Norris, who is pure evil, there are shades of grey to every single character in this book. Henry Crawford is one of the most interesting rake characters in Austen's novels. And again, I say that as someone who didn't really like Mansfield Park. The characters in Seeking Mansfield are disappointingly flat. They don't feel like real people, in the slightest. The only one who had a satisfying character arc was Finley, which is good, since she is the protagonist, and if she was as two-dimensional as the rest of them, I would have DNF'd this book without a question. Wait, did I just say that Finley is the protagonist? Because that's not entirely true. Because for some reason I cannot understand at all, the author decided to tell this story from 2 points of view, with alternating chapters. Finley Price, and, in a move that makes no sense whatsoever, Oliver Bertram, who is this version's Edmund. Here's the thing about Edmund Bertram in Mansfield Park. Well, he's a great supporting character who changes throughout the book, going from being Fanny's somewhat condescending protector to then ignoring her the moment Mary Crawford enters the picture, to finally being a somewhat shoehorned in love interest. He is not a protagonist. And he's not a protagonist in Seeking Mansfield either. I'm sure a good author could have taken Edmund Bertram, given him a proper main character arc, and then written a dual point of view retelling, where both he and Finley Price go through a character transformation. But that sadly didn't happen in this book. He's a side character whose meaningless voice takes up half the pages of this book. The Oliver Bertram point of view does not make any sense. I also dislike how central the romance plot is in this book. It takes up much more space than it does in Mansfield Park. I've always been of the opinion that Mansfield Park would have worked better without that plotline. I find it a bit forced, and I think it's only there because for a character like Fanny Price to have the happy ending she deserves in this 19th century context, there had to be a wedding. There doesn't have to be a wedding or a teenage relationship in a modernized version, but there is. I can't even really fault the author for writing romance into this, because she's only sticking to the original, but it's perhaps a missed chance. And what I can fault the author for is for making that romance so very bland and predictable, and without even a drop of chemistry, and then also trying to make that the driving force of the plot. And so the book trudges along. As I said before, the writing isn't bad, but it is a bit trite, a bit clumsy. Add to that the flatness of the characters, and it doesn't make for a particularly fun reading experience. The author writes so many tropes without questioning them or subverting them. Juliet Bertram, the evil stepsister, is evil, and you can tell because she really likes clothes and makeup. Finley doesn't care about clothes and makeup, and that's because she's a good person. Mr. and Mrs. Bertram don't make any sense as characters. They flip-flop without explanation, from being caring parents who practically adopted Finley and love her like one of their own children, to thoughtless and exploitative. Oliver Bertram is super into Finley from the very first page, but due to some very convenient misunderstandings, she doesn't realize that until right at the end. Tate Bertram, this version's Tom Bertram, is morally weak because he drinks and gambles. Actually, that one is accurate to Mansfield Park, so fair enough. But that brings me to another aspect of the book that made me cringe on several occasions. And that's how the author writes about drinking and partying in general. I get that American teenagers are maybe a little bit more conservative than European ones, but the whole book had such a prudish vibe about it, which on the one hand isn't miles away from the strict morality of Mansfield Park, a book I always think of as Jane Austen's most uptight novel. But it makes for such a weird reading experience when the story is about supposedly free-spirited theatre types, but written like a signed reading for Mormon teenagers. You're telling me that these kids unironically say heck instead of hell? Give me a break. There was one bit in particular that made me stop reading and say out loud, I'm pretty sure the author is either Mormon or fundamentalist Christian. And it's a party scene in which Oliver Bertram is drinking a cocktail, and then Finley goes up to him and says, and I quote, "They gave you a caipirinha, Ollie?" she cried, tears burning her eyes. "It's like extreme alcohol." This is not meant as a joke. Extreme alcohol indeed. By the way, I turned out to be right about the author being Mormon, but that's neither here nor there. The point is, there is an underlying preachiness about Seeking Mansfield that made me roll my eyes on more than one occasion. Like the whole thing about alcohol. I know Americans aren't allowed to drink until they're middle-aged, but you don't need to have spent your youth drinking badly made caipirinhas out of plastic cups at German house parties to know that not even an innocent 17-year-old is going to get blackout drunk from a single cocktail. These teenagers don't act like teenagers, and that bothers me. Not just the pearl clutching around drinking and partying, but also the way they interact with each other. The inner monologue of both Finley and Oliver is sanitized to the point of implausibility. And don't get me wrong, I don't need to see explicit anything in a young adult novel, but these kids are so innocent it reads like a pro-abstinence leaflet. All things considered, this book was a bit of a slog. I finished it, which means it wasn't unreadable by any means, but the predictable plot combined with the clumsy writing, shallow characterization, and weird Sunday school vibes made it more than a bit disappointing. I still believe that Mansfield Park would make for a fantastic YA retelling, so if you can recommend one that doesn't fall into the same pitfalls as Seeking Mansfield, do let me know. This book is fairly well reviewed on Goodreads, so I know my opinion isn't mainstream, but I would like to hear from you if you've read the book, so drop me a comment down below. Thank you for watching. Bye!